Let's answer this immediately. Yes. The United States government did support a plan to remove Black Americans from the country and send them to Africa, not as a theory, not as a fringe idea, as a real, organized movement backed by powerful politicians, wealthy donors, and even some of the most respected names in American history. And it didn't happen in secret. It happened in public, with ships, with funding, with laws, and with a clear goal to solve what many white Americans at the time called the problem of free Black people. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this wasn't just a racist scheme pushed by slave owners. Some Black leaders supported it too. That's the part nobody tells you. So before you pick a side, you need to understand what was actually happening, because the reality is more complicated than either side usually admits. The organization at the center of all of this was called the American Colonization Society, founded in 1816. Its mission sounded simple on the surface: take free Black Americans and resettle them in Africa. But the reasons behind it, that's where everything splits. For some white supporters, the goal was obvious. They didn't want free Black people in the United States, not because of slavery, but because free Black communities challenged the entire racial order. If enslaved people were supposed to be inferior, then how do you explain free Black people building lives, businesses, and communities? It didn't fit the narrative. So instead of changing the system, they tried to remove the contradiction. Send free Black people somewhere else, out of sight, out of the country. Problem solved. But not everyone supporting colonization was thinking like that. Some genuinely believed they were helping. They argued that Black Americans would never be treated equally in the United States, that racism was too deeply embedded, that no matter what happened with slavery, true freedom would never exist there. So in their minds, Africa represented something else, a place where Black people could govern themselves, build their own nation, live without white control. That's the version of the story you'll hear in textbooks. But reality sat somewhere in between, because for Black Americans at the time, the choice wasn't simple. It wasn't stay or leave. It was stay in a country that doesn't see you as equal, or go to a place you've never been. Most of the people being pushed into this decision had never set foot in Africa. They were generations removed. Their language, culture, and identity were American, not African. So when the Colonization Society started organizing actual voyages, it wasn't just relocation. It was displacement. The first ships left in the early 1820s, carrying free Black Americans across the Atlantic to a place that would eventually become Liberia, a country founded by them, but not necessarily for them, because when they arrived, they weren't landing in empty land. There were already people living there, indigenous African communities who had their own systems, cultures, and territories. And what happened next is something most people never hear. The settlers from America, later called Americo-Liberians, didn't just integrate, they built a system, one that looked very familiar. They established political control, created social hierarchies, and over time, ended up dominating the local population. Think about that for a second. A group of people who had experienced oppression in America arrived in Africa and built a society where they held the power. That's not a simple story, and it's not a comfortable one. Back in the United States, the colonization movement kept growing. It gained support from politicians, from religious groups, from people who believed it was a solution to slavery, and from people who just didn't want Black Americans in the country. Even President James Monroe supported the effort. In fact, the capital of Liberia, Monrovia, is named after him. That's how deep this went. This wasn't a side project. It was tied directly to the highest levels of American power. But here's the part that changed everything. Most Black Americans rejected it. Not quietly, not passively, loudly, publicly. They saw it for what it was. Not an opportunity, but an attempt to remove them from the only home they knew. Leaders like Frederick Douglass spoke against colonization, arguing that America was their country, built by their labor, paid for in blood, and that they had just as much right to it as anyone else. That resistance mattered, because without it, this story could have ended very differently. But even though most people refused to go, the idea never fully disappeared, because it was never just about relocation. It was about a deeper question. Who belongs in America and who doesn't? That question didn't end in the 1800s. It just changed form. Because once you understand this part of history, you start to say something unsettling. The idea of removing Black people from America wasn't a fringe thought. It was once considered a legitimate solution. And the only reason it didn't fully succeed, it is because the people it targeted refused to disappear. Here's where the story takes a turn most people are not ready for. Because the colonization idea didn't just exist on the edges of American politics. It reached the very top. Abraham Lincoln supported it, at least for a period of time. And that changes how you understand everything. In the early years of the Civil War, Lincoln was not focused on creating a multiracial democracy. His priority was preserving the Union. And in his view, the presence of free Black Americans was still seen as a problem that needed a solution. Not because he believed in slavery, but because he believed the country might never accept racial equality. That distinction matters because it explains why, even as he moved toward emancipation, he continued to push colonization as a possible answer. In 1862, Lincoln did something that almost no one talks about. He invited a group of Black leaders to the White House, and instead of discussing rights, protection, or equality, he suggested they consider leaving the country. He told them that the presence of Black people in America was, in his words, a cause of conflict, and that both races would be better off separated. Think about the timing. This is the same year he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation, the same moment he is moving toward ending slavery. He is also entertaining the idea of removing the people being freed. That contradiction is the story, because it reveals something deeper than politics. It reveals uncertainty. Lincoln wasn't alone in this thinking. There was a widespread belief among white Americans, even some who opposed slavery, that coexistence would fail. That racism was too deeply rooted, that the country could not function with both groups living as equals. So colonization wasn't always framed as punishment. Sometimes it was framed as inevitability. And that's what made it dangerous, because when something is framed as inevitable, people stop questioning it. They start planning around it. And that's exactly what happened. The government began exploring actual colonization projects beyond Liberia. Not just ideas, real plans. One of the most serious attempts was in Central America, specifically a location known as Chiriquí in present-day Panama. The plan was to relocate thousands of Black Americans there, to build a colony under U.S. influence, funded, organized, and controlled by American interests. It wasn't a random proposal. It had backing, it had structure, It had momentum, but it also had problems, massive ones. The land deals were questionable, the logistics were unstable, and the people being asked to go were not convinced because by this point, something had shifted. Black Americans were no longer thinking in terms of escape. They were thinking in terms of ownership. They had built lives in the United States, worked the land, built communities, created culture, fought for survival in a system designed against them. And now they were being told the solution was to leave. That didn't sit right. So resistance grew stronger. Public meetings, speeches, organizing. A clear message started forming. We are not going anywhere. That pushback forced the government to slow down. Projects stalled, plans collapsed, support weakened, and Lincoln himself began to shift. As the war progressed, as the black soldiers began fighting for the Union, as the political reality changed, colonization became less practical, less defendable, less necessary, and eventually it faded out of its policy direction. But it never fully disappeared from American thinking. That's the part people miss. Because even though the official plans failed, the idea behind them didn't. The idea that black Americans were separate, the idea that they didn't fully belong, the idea that their presence created tension that needed to be managed, those ideas stayed. They just evolved. And if you zoom out for a second, you start to see the bigger pattern. Colonization wasn't just about sending people somewhere else. It was about avoiding a harder question. What does equality actually look like? Because removing people is easier than integrating them. Separation is easier than transformation. And that's what made colonization appealing to so many different groups for so many different reasons. It gave them an answer that didn't require changing the system, just relocating the problem. But here's the reality that became impossible to ignore. The people they were trying to relocate were not temporary. They were not outsiders. They were Americans. And the more that truth became undeniable, the weaker colonization became as a solution. But by the time it faded, it had already left a mark. Not just in Liberia, not just in the failed colonies, but in the mindset of a country still trying to figure out who belongs. And that question was far from settled. Now, we need to go to Liberia because this is where the theory becomes reality. And the reality is not what most people expect. When black Americans arrived on the West African coast in the early 1800s, they weren't stepping into a blank space. They were entering a region already filled with established societies, communities with their own leadership structures, languages, trade networks, and history that went back centuries. Groups like the Capella, the Kru, the Bassa, they had land, they had systems, they had power. And suddenly, a new group arrives, backed by American money, backed by American ships, backed indirectly by American political influence. That changes the equation immediately. Because even though the settlers were black, they were not the same as the people already living there. They dressed differently, spoke differently, practiced different forms of religion, and more importantly, they came with a completely different idea of what society should look like. The settlers didn't see themselves as just another group integrating into the region. They saw themselves as founders, builders of a new nation. And they built that nation in a very specific image, an American one. They created a government modeled after the United States with a constitution, elections, a capital city, Monrovia, named after an American president. Even the architects reflected this mindset. large houses, Western-style clothing, English as the official language. From the outside, it looked like a black republic. From the inside, it was more complicated because power didn't distribute evenly. The Americo-Liberians, the Sohops, the descendants of the settlers, quickly became the ruling class. They controlled the government, the economy, the political system, and the indigenous populations. They were pushed to the margins, excluded from political power, excluded from decision-making, expected to adapt to a system they didn't design. If this sounds familiar, it should, because structurally it mirrored the kind of hierarchy the settlers had experienced in America. Different contexts, same imbalance, and that created tension almost immediately, not just cultural tension, political tension, economic tension, because now you have two groups, one controlling the state, one existing under it. And over time, that gap widened. The Americo-Liberian elite developed its own identity, distinct from both Americans and indigenous Africans. They saw themselves as civilizers, leaders bringing order, structure, and governance. But from the perspective of the local populations, they were outsiders holding power. That difference in perspective matters because it shapes how the entire system functions. And it explains why Liberia, despite being founded as a place of freedom, developed its own internal divisions. By the late 1800s, those divisions were deeply embedded. Political participation was restricted, economic opportunities were uneven, and the majority of the population had little influence over the direction of the country. That's not what people imagine when they hear the origin story. They hear freed people returning to Africa to build a nation, but they don't hear what happened after that. They don't hear about the power structures, the exclusions, the tensions that built over decades. And that omission matters because it changes how you understand the entire colonization project. This wasn't just about relocation. It was about control. Control over land, control over governance, control over identity. And once that system was in place, it stayed in place for over a century. The Americo-Liberian elite dominated Liberia's political system well into the 1900s, holding power through a single ruling party, maintaining influence across generations, and limiting access for the broader population. That kind of stability might sound positive on the surface, but when power is concentrated like that, it creates pressure, and pressure builds slowly, quietly, until it doesn't. Because systems like that don't just disappear, they break. And when they break, they don't do it gently, they do it all at once. That moment came in 1980, a military coup, led by a group of indigenous soldiers, overthrew the Americo-Liberian government, ended over a century of elite control, and completely reshaped the country. That event didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of decades of imbalance, decades of exclusion, decades of a system that never fully integrated the people it governed. And that brings us back to the original idea. Colonization was supposed to solve a problem, supposed to create stability, supposed to offer a future. But what it actually created was a new set of problems in a new place. Different geography, same underlying issue, power without inclusion, control without representation. And once you see that pattern, you start to understand something important. Moving people doesn't fix inequality, it relocates it. And that realization forces you to look at the original plan differently. Because if the goal was freedom, why did the system look so familiar? And if the goal was independence, Why did it depend so heavily on the structures it claimed to escape? Those are the questions that sit at the center of this story. And they don't have simple answers, but they do point to something deeper. Because while all of this was unfolding in Liberia, back in the United States, something else was happening. Something that would make the idea of colonization harder and harder to justify. Black Americans weren't disappearing. They were becoming impossible to ignore. While ships were crossing the Atlantic, most Black Americans stayed, and that decision changed everything because instead of leaving the country that rejected them, they started building inside it, not slowly, not quietly, deliberately, relentlessly, right in the middle of a system that was not designed for them to succeed. This is the part of the story that breaks the entire logic of colonization, because the idea behind colonization was simple. Black Americans would never be able to build stable, independent lives in the United States. That was the assumption. That was the justification. That was the argument used to push people out. And then reality did the opposite. Across the country, Black communities started forming their own systems, schools, churches, businesses, entire economic networks, all operating within a society that limited access to land, capital, and legal protection. That's not supposed to work, but it did. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, there was a brief window where that progress accelerated fast. Black men entered politics, held office, helped shape state governments. In places like South Carolina and Mississippi, Black legislators weren't just present, they were influential. That alone challenged everything colonization supporters believed, because now the question wasn't theoretical anymore. It was visible. If Black Americans could participate in government, if they could run businesses, if they could build institutions, then the argument that they needed to be relocated started collapsing in real time. But the progress didn't come without resistance, because as quickly as those communities began to grow, there was an equally strong push to shut them down. Violence, legal restrictions, economic pressure, all used to limit how far that growth could go. And yes, even under that pressure, something kept happening. Black communities adapted. They found ways to build in the gaps. They created systems within systems, parallel economies, support networks that didn't rely on approval from the broader society. This is where you start to see the real turning point. Because once people commit to building where they are, the idea of leaving becomes less realistic, less appealing, less acceptable. And over time, colonization stopped looking like an option. It started looking like an exit from something that people were actively trying to claim. That shift is critical because it reframes the entire story. Colonization wasn't defeated by policy alone. It was defeated by behavior, by people choosing to stay, choosing to invest in the place they were told they didn't belong. And that decision had long-term consequences, because every institution built, every business opened, every community formed, made it harder to argue that Black Americans were temporary or separate or removable. They weren't. They were embedded economically, socially, culturally, and that made the original plan obsolete. Not overnight, but steadily. Because once people establish roots, removing them becomes a different kind of problem, not just logistical, political, moral, practical. And by the late 1800s, the energy behind colonization had largely faded. Not because everyone agreed it was wrong, but because it no longer worked. The scale wasn't there. The support wasn't unified. And the people it targeted had made a different choice. Stay, build, claim space. That doesn't mean the underlying attitudes disappeared. They didn't. The idea that Black Americans were separate, that they didn't fully belong, that they should exist on the margins, those ideas didn't vanish. They shifted. They became policies, systems, barriers built into everyday life. But the physical removal, that part was off the table. And that's important because it shows how close things came to going in a completely different direction. If more people had accepted colonization, if more resources had been committed, if resistance had been weaker, the demographic, cultural, and political structure of the United States could look very different today. But that's not what happened. What happened instead was a long, ongoing process of negotiation. Who gets access? Who gets opportunity? Who gets recognized as fully belonging? And that process didn't end with Reconstruction. It didn't end in the 1900s. It didn't end at all. Because once a country reaches that kind of turning point, it doesn't resolve cleanly. It carries forward into policy, into economics, into everyday life, and the legacy of colonization thinking, even after the ship stopped sailing, didn't disappear. It changed form. Because at its core, colonization was never just about geography. It was about distance. Who's kept at a distance? Who's brought in? And who gets to define the boundaries? And once you start looking at American history through that lens, you begin to notice something. The method changes, but the question stays the same. Who belongs here and who doesn't? When colonization started collapsing, the goal didn't disappear. It adjusted because the original objective was never just relocation. It was separation, distance, control. And once sending millions of people across the ocean stopped being realistic, a new approach took its place. Keep them here, but keep them apart. That shift is where segregation comes in. Not as a random development, but as a continuation of the same underlying logic. If you can't remove a population physically, you structure society so they exist in a separate space. Different neighborhoods, different schools, different opportunities, same country, different realities. And it didn't happen by accident. It was built through law, through policy, through decisions made at every level of government. After Reconstruction ended, the brief period of political progress collapsed fast. Federal protection disappeared. State governments regained control. And one by one, systems were put in place to limit access. Voting restrictions, property limitations, education inequalities, each one narrowing the space available, each one reinforcing the idea of separation. But here's the key difference from colonization. This version didn't require ships. It didn't require relocation. It worked within the existing geography, which made it easier to maintain, harder to challenge, and more permanent. Because now the separation wasn't temporary, it was structured, built into everyday life. You didn't need to ask people to leave. You just made sure they couldn't fully participate. And that system held for decades, not quietly, not subtly, openly, legally, with enforcement. And the impact wasn't just social, it was economic. Because when you separate populations, you also separate resources. Access to jobs, access to capital, access to infrastructure, all controlled through the same framework. And once those patterns are established, they compound. Over time, the gap widens. Opportunities concentrate in one space, limitations concentrate in another, and the distance becomes self-reinforcing. That's the part people often miss. Segregation wasn't just about where people lived. It was about how systems distribute advantage. And once those systems are in place, they don't need constant adjustment. They run automatically, producing the same outcomes over and over again. And if you step back, the connection to colonization becomes clear. Different method, same goal, maintain separation, control interaction, limit integration. Because full integration requires something harder. It requires restructuring the system itself. And historically, that's the part that gets resisted the most. So instead, separation becomes the default, even when it's no longer called that. Even when the language changes, the structure remains. Now, here's where it gets more complex. Because while these systems were being built, Black Americans kept building too. Inside the constraints, within the limits, creating communities that function despite the barriers. Businesses, cultural institutions, networks of support, all operating in parallel. That's where you get places like Tulsa, Durham, other economic centers that developed under segregation. Not because the system supported them, but because they had to exist independently. And that independence came with its own tension, because success within a separate system still exists inside a larger, unequal one, which means it can be disrupted, undermined, or removed. And in many cases, it was through violence, through policy, through economic pressure. The pattern repeats: build, grow, get restricted, adapt, continue. That cycle runs for decades, and through all of it, the original idea of separation never fully disappears. It evolves. Sometimes it's legal, sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's social, but the structure remains recognizable. Because at its core, it's solving the same question in the same way, not through inclusion, through distance. And that brings us to something important, because by the mid-20th century, the system starts to face real pressure. Legal challenges, public resistance, organized movements pushing directly against segregation. And for the first time, the structure itself is forced to respond, not adjust around the edges, change, or at least appear to. Because once segregation becomes openly challenged, maintaining it in the same form becomes harder, not impossible, but harder to justify, harder to defend. And that's where the next shift happens. Because just like colonization turned into segregation, segregation doesn't stay the same either. It changes form, less visible, less direct, but still present. And if you trace that evolution forward, you start to see something. The method keeps changing, but the outcome doesn't shift as much as you'd expect, which raises a bigger question. If the structure keeps adapting, has the original idea ever really gone away, or has it just become harder to recognize? By the time segregation was publicly challenged, the strategy had already begun to evolve again. Because once a system becomes too visible, it becomes vulnerable. It can be attacked, changed, legislated against. So the next version had to be less obvious, less direct, harder to point at. And that's exactly what happened. The language shifted first. You no longer needed to say separate. You could say things like local control, economic reality, market forces, terms that sound neutral, but produce very specific outcomes. Because if you stop enforcing separation directly, but maintain the conditions that create it, the result stays the same, just harder to trace. Housing is one of the clearest examples. Instead of explicit rules about where people could live. You get policies that influence who can afford to live where. Lending practices, zoning decisions, investment patterns, each one shaping the map without announcing it. And once those patterns are in place, they don't need constant enforcement. They reinforce themselves. Neighborhoods develop differently. Schools receive different levels of funding. Businesses cluster in certain areas. Infrastructure follows investment. And over time, the gap becomes embedded. Not because someone is actively drawing lines every day, but because the system was set up to produce that outcome. That's the shift from visible control to structural influence. And that makes it harder to connect back to the original idea because it doesn't look like removal anymore. It doesn't look like separation in the traditional sense. It looks like normal variation, different outcomes, different environments, different opportunities, all explained as natural. But when you trace those outcomes backward, you start to see the continuity, the same question, handled in a more complex way. Who gets full access? Who operates on the margins? And how is that difference maintained? The answers aren't always written in law anymore. They're built into systems, economic systems, educational systems, geographic systems, each one reinforcing the other. And because they operate together, they're harder to isolate, harder to change, harder to even describe clearly. That's why this part of the story is often misunderstood. People look for a single cause, a single policy, a single decision. But what you're actually looking at is a network, a set of conditions that produce consistent patterns over time. And once those conditions are in place, they don't need constant adjustment. They run. And here's where it connects directly back to colonization. Because the original idea wasn't just about location, it was about separation, about managing difference through distance. Physical distance at first, then legal separation, now structural distance, different form, same function. And once you recognize that pattern, it changes how you see the present. Because the question is no longer, did colonization happen? You already know it did. The question is, what parts of that thinking are still active? Not in the same language, not in the same form, but in the outcomes. Because if you see consistent gaps in access, consistent differences in opportunity, consistent patterns across different systems, you have to ask where those patterns come from. They don't appear randomly. They're produced, maintained, reinforced, sometimes intentionally, sometimes just by continuing what already exists. And that's what makes this difficult to address, because changing a visible rule is one thing. Changing an entire structure is something else. It requires coordination, time, and a willingness to question systems that are often treated as neutral. But neutral systems don't produce consistent disparities by accident. They produce them by design or by inheritance. And inheritance matters because systems carry forward the logic they were built on. Even after the original context disappears, even after the language changes, the structure remains. And that's the part that links everything together, from colonization to segregation to modern systems. Different stages of the same underlying approach, managing difference through separation, not always explicitly, but consistently. And once you see that continuity, it becomes harder to treat each period as disconnected. They're not separate events. They're transitions, adaptations, adjustments to changing conditions, but moving in the same direction. And that brings us to the final piece, because understanding the pattern is one thing. Understanding its impact is another. And if you follow the consequences all the way through, you end up at a question that still hasn't been fully answered. Not in the 1800s, not in the 1900s, and not today. What does full inclusion actually require? Not in theory, in practice. Because every version of this system has avoided that question by choosing separation in one form or another. And until that question is addressed directly, the pattern doesn't break. It just changes again. Here's the part that usually gets skipped, not because it's unimportant, but because it complicates the story. This entire history doesn't fit into a clean narrative. It doesn't divide neatly into heroes and villains. It doesn't give you a simple takeaway. And that's exactly why it gets left out. Because most history that gets taught at scale is simplified, compressed into something easy to understand, easy to remember, easy to repeat. Colonization doesn't work like that. Because if you present it honestly, you have to show contradictions. You have to show that people on different sides supported it for completely different reasons. You have to show that some of the same figures associated with progress also supported separation. You have to show that solutions created new problems. And that makes it harder to package, harder to teach, harder to fit into a short explanation. So instead, it gets reduced or ignored completely. You might hear a brief mention of Liberia, a sentence about freed people returning to Africa, and then the story moves on. No detail, no explanation of the debates, no discussion of the consequences, just enough information to acknowledge it happened, not enough to understand it. And when that happens, something important gets lost, because without that context, the rest of the timeline looks disconnected. Segregation appears as a separate development. Modern disparities look like isolated issues instead of parts of a longer sequence. That's the impact of leaving this out. It breaks the continuity. And once that continuity is broken, it becomes easier to misunderstand the present, because you're missing the earlier stages, the foundational ideas, the transitions that led from one system to another. Now, here's the other reason this doesn't get much attention. It challenges assumptions on multiple sides. If you approach the story expecting a clear moral alignment, you don't get one. You get complexity. You get disagreement. You get competing visions of what freedom looked like. And that's harder to engage with, because it requires holding multiple perspectives at the same time. Understanding why some people saw colonization as an opportunity, understanding why others saw it as removal, understanding how both of those views existed simultaneously. That kind of nuance doesn't always translate well in simplified formats. So it gets flattened, reduced to a single angle, or removed entirely. But if you actually look at the full picture, you start to see why it matters. Because this wasn't a minor idea. It wasn't a side conversation. It was a serious proposal, backed by resources, discussed at the highest levels, considered as a potential solution to a major national issue. That alone makes it significant. But the implications go further, because once you understand that this idea was taken seriously, you have to ask, what made it seem reasonable at the time? What assumptions were in place? What beliefs made people think separation was the best option? And once you identify those beliefs, you can trace them forward, see how they evolve, see where they show up later. That's where the real value of this history is, not just in knowing that colonization happened, but in understanding the thinking behind it, because ideas don't disappear just because policies change. They adapt. They reappear in different forms, sometimes obvious, sometimes not. And if you're only looking at the surface, you miss that connection. Now, here's the final layer, because this story also disrupts another expectation, the idea that progress follows a straight line, that once something is recognized as flawed, it gets replaced by something better. That's not how this works. What you see instead is iteration. One approach gives way to another, not always because it's more just, but because it's more practical under new conditions. Colonization becomes segregation. Segregation becomes structural systems, each stage responding to pressure, adjusting to constraints, but not necessarily resolving the original issue. And that's why this history matters right now. Because if you think the story ended, you stop looking for the pattern. You treat each period as separate, each issue as isolated, instead of recognizing the continuity. And once you lose that continuity, it becomes harder to understand why certain outcomes persist, why certain patterns repeat, why certain questions never fully go away. That's the cost of not teaching this properly, not just a missing chapter, but a missing connection between what was proposed, what was built, and what still exists. And once you see that connection clearly, you can't unsee it, because it changes how you interpret everything that comes after. By the mid-19th century, the idea of sending Black Americans back to Africa wasn't fringe. It was a national debate, not a passing suggestion. This was debated in Congress, proposed by politicians, intellectuals, and activists alike. Some saw it as a humanitarian gesture. Others saw it as a convenient solution to systemic oppression. But here's what most textbooks skip: the scale and seriousness. The U.S. government actually funded expeditions, paid ships, provided supplies, negotiated with African leaders. Liberia wasn't a casual settlement. It was designed as an American-backed colony, an experiment, a projection of American policy across the Atlantic. Black Americans who left weren't just migrating, they were being recruited, persuaded, and pressured. And the recruitment wasn't uniform. Wealthy, free Black Americans were often skeptical, saw themselves as Americans, saw the U.S. as home. Enslaved or recently freed populations sometimes had little choice. Opportunities were framed as freedom, but with strings attached. The logistical complexity was staggering. Ships had to cross the Atlantic. Supplies had to sustain settlers. Governance structures had to be established in unfamiliar lands. And all of this occurred while the U.S. was simultaneously debating slavery, territorial expansion, and the rights of freed people at home. Here's the critical point. Colonization policies reveal more about American racial imagination than African reality. The U.S. government's plan assumed that Black Americans couldn't coexist with white Americans. That separation was necessary for peace, order, or progress. It also assumed Africa was a blank canvas, a place to transplant populations with minimal concern for existing societies, politics, or cultures. And that assumption had consequences. Settlers encountered resistance, disease, harsh climates, political tensions, conflicts with indigenous and local communities. And still, the American narrative framed these failures as individual shortcomings, ignoring the systemic planning errors and racial assumptions baked into the project. Meanwhile, propaganda at home painted colonization as moral, even generous. Books, speeches, and newspapers described it as lifting the race, or providing opportunity, carefully omitting coercion, survival struggles, and cultural erasure. Here's the irony. The same leaders pushing colonization often oppose meaningful racial equality in the U.S. They didn't advocate integration, rights, or structural reforms. They advocated removal, exportation, detachment. And that distinction is critical. Colonization wasn't just geographic, it was ideological. It reinforced the notion that black people were outsiders in their own country, that their full participation in society was negotiable or even undesirable. It's also why the debate around Liberia remains so misunderstood. Many think of Liberia as purely a story of African nation building. They don't recognize the American blueprint behind it, the imposed political structures, the economic dependencies, the enduring influence of American ideals, laws, and social hierarchies. And even for those who survived and built communities, identity was complex. Liberians were simultaneously descendants of enslaved Africans, American cultural recipients, and neighbors to centuries-old African populations. That tension shaped politics, society, and conflict in ways rarely discussed. Back in the U.S., colonization advocates faced criticism from black leaders. Frederick Douglass called it a sham, a lie. He insisted black Americans had every right to remain in their homeland and claim full citizenship. Others argued pragmatically, if freedom was impossible in the U.S., immigration might offer a chance to escape oppression. And that split shows why colonization was never simple. It wasn't a universally imposed policy. It wasn't universally accepted. It was a battlefield of ideas, identity, belonging, freedom, and the limits of American democracy. Here's where most people get it wrong. Colonization wasn't merely sending people away. It was the U.S. government experimenting with population control, racial hierarchy, and political optics, all while claiming moral superiority. And the lessons carry forward. Understanding this history clarifies modern debates about systemic exclusion, racialized narratives, and the persistent question, who belongs in America? Because colonization isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a lens. It shows how policy, race, and ideology intersected to reshape lives, territories, and continents. And when you connect the dots from U.S. policy to Liberia's founding, to debates among freed people, to the global African diaspora, you see a pattern that's rarely acknowledged in classrooms. Colonization is the missing link in understanding the 19th century racial imaginations. It's why contemporary discussions about migration, integration, and reparations can't ignore this chapter. Because what happened wasn't an isolated experiment. It was part of a broader, systemic effort to manage black bodies, define citizenship, and control narrative. And that's why learning this matters today. It challenges the myths you've been told about freedom, opportunity, and what it meant to be black in 19th century America. By the 1820s, the first waves of black Americans arrived on the West African coast. Ships from the United States brought men and women free and recently emancipated to a land they had never seen. They called it Liberia, land of the free, but freedom came with strings. The settlers weren't entering a blank continent. Local African communities had centuries-old social, political, and trade structures. Kingdoms, villages, and cultural systems thrived long before the arrival of American settlers. And that's where tension began. Black Americans carried with them the memory of oppression, the language of liberty, and the culture of a country they had left behind. They also carried assumptions, American laws, governance models, and racial hierarchies transplanted directly across the Atlantic. The result? A society with layered conflict. Settlers attempted to impose American-style institutions, elected officials, property laws, and schools based on U.S. models. Indigenous Africans often resisted or adapted these systems selectively. Trade and resource control created additional friction. Settlers claimed prime land, established ports, and controlled commerce, often sidelining local communities. Yet, survival demanded compromise. Disease, food shortages, and unfamiliar terrain forced settlers to rely on local knowledge. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical fever decimated early arrivals, reducing numbers dramatically. Those who survived were hardened, resilient, and politically ambitious. Over time, a new elite emerged. The Americo-Liberians, descendants of the U.S. settlers who controlled political power for generations. And here's the stark contrast. The power dynamics mirrored in some ways the racial hierarchies they had escaped in America. It was ironic. Those who fled discrimination often created new structures of exclusion. Meanwhile, the indigenous populations remained outside the formal power systems, navigating between settler authority and traditional governance. Cultural assimilation wasn't automatic. Settlers imported language, Christianity, architecture, and educational systems. They celebrated American independence, reenacted U.S. political rituals, and sought to maintain ties with the United States. Yet African traditions persisted among both settlers and local communities. Music, cuisine, social norms, and spiritual practices blended in complex ways. And that blending created a unique Liberian identity, African roots, American influence, and a shared experience of colonial negotiation. Economically, Liberia struggled. Exports were limited. Agriculture, primarily rice and coffee, faced challenges. Trade was constrained by geography and competition. The settlers' American ideals collided with West African realities, producing a society that was both aspirational and precarious. Internationally, Liberia was both celebrated and marginalized. European powers and the United States recognized it cautiously, seeing it as a foothold for influence in West Africa rather than a fully autonomous nation. Diplomacy required settlers to constantly negotiate with European traders, local leaders, and African polities, balancing sovereignty with survival. For Black Americans in Liberia, identity was never simple. They were Americans and Africans simultaneously, navigating questions of loyalty, culture, and belonging. Many settlers hoped to create a second chance society, free from racial oppression in the United States, but reality proved more complicated. Social stratification emerged quickly. Americo-Liberians dominated politics, commerce, and land ownership, while indigenous communities were marginalized in official systems. This hierarchy sparked tensions that lasted decades, often erupting into conflict, both political and military. Education was both a tool and a divider. Schools taught U.S.-style curricula, literacy, and Christian values to settlers' children. Indigenous communities often received less access, reinforcing social divisions. Religion shaped the cultural landscape profoundly. Christianity became a marker of settler identity, while indigenous spiritual practices persisted, creating a dual religious environment. And yet, despite those challenges, Liberia endured. It became a symbol of resilience for Black Americans and the African diaspora. It offered a narrative of of self-determination, however imperfect, in a world that largely denied Black agency. At the same time, the colonization project illuminated the limitations of American racial thinking. Sending people back across the Atlantic could not erase centuries of social, economic, and cultural oppression. It also couldn't erase the ideological baggage settlers carried with them: hierarchies, assumptions, and definitions of citizenship and property. Liberia became an ongoing experiment in governance, identity, and survival, an extension of American policy, but a distinctly African reality. For Black Americans watching from afar, the colony was a mirror. It reflected both possibilities and contradictions, freedom and exclusion, opportunity and hierarchy, self-determination and dependence. And the lessons from Liberia remain relevant today. They remind us that forced or encouraged migration, whether framed as humanitarian or political, is never neutral. Power, privilege, and historical context shape outcomes as much as intention. And the history of Liberia forces a reckoning with American ideas of race, nationhood, and belonging. Because the story of colonization is not just a footnote. It is a critical chapter in understanding the African diaspora, the United States racial imagination, and the long-term consequences of policy decisions on Black communities across the globe. By the late 19th century, Liberia had survived, but the cost was immense. Settlers had established cities, governance, and trade networks, but deep social hierarchies persisted. Americo-Liberians maintained control, mirroring the power structures they had fled in the United States. Indigenous populations remained marginalized politically, economically, and socially, highlighting a paradox of a freedom abroad. Back in the United States, the story of Liberia faded from public consciousness. Most Americans, Black and white alike, saw it as a failed or irrelevant experiment. Few understood that it wasn't simply a distant colony. It was a direct consequence of U.S. policy toward Black citizens. The American Colonization Society, ACS, had spent decades shaping public perception, framing immigration as a solution to racial tension. Their message was clear: send free Black Americans back to Africa, and the United States could maintain a white-dominated society. Yet, as history shows, this policy was deeply flawed. First, the vast majority of Black Americans had no desire to leave the country they were born in. Generations of enslaved Africans had been torn from their homelands centuries earlier, making return a complicated and often meaningless concept. Second, Liberia revealed the limits of transplanting American social norms onto an African context. Governance models, property rights, and social hierarchies imposed by settlers created tension and inequality, rather than the utopia AAECS promoters had promised. The irony was unmistakable. Black Americans who sought freedom abroad often replicated structures of oppression they had escaped at home. Meanwhile, the United States continued to deny citizenship rights, voting access, and social equality to Black citizens. Segregation, Jim Crow laws, and systemic violence remained entrenched. Liberia's story was a cautionary tale, showing that removing people from oppressive systems did not automatically produce liberation. It exposed how social, political, and economic power shapes outcomes more than intention alone. By the 20th century, Liberia had gained limited recognition internationally, yet it remained economically dependent, politically fragile, and socially divided. The Americo-Liberian elite dominated. Indigenous communities struggled for inclusion, and the country's survival relied heavily on foreign aid and trade relationships with Western nations. The experiment highlighted broader truths about race, migration, and sovereignty. It forced American policymakers and society to confront a fundamental question. Could freedom be legislated or exported without confronting domestic inequality? The answer clearly was no. Black Americans sent or encouraged to leave did not find a perfect refuge. Liberia offered autonomy but demanded adaptation, resilience, and navigation of complex cultural dynamics. Many settlers died young from disease, others struggled with isolation, and entire generations wrestled with identity. Were they African or American? Were they liberators or colonizers? Were they free or trapped within a new hierarchy? These questions were not abstract. They shaped lives, communities, and the legacy of diaspora for decades. Back in the U.S., Black leaders debated the ethics and practicality of colonization. Some, like Martin Delany, supported migration, but on terms defined by Black Americans themselves. Others rejected the idea entirely, seeing it as a scheme that shifted responsibility away from the United States to address systemic racism. The tension remains irrelevant. Modern discussions of repatriation, immigration, and diaspora identity echo the debates surrounding Liberia. The lessons are clear. Migration alone does not solve inequality. Social systems, political power, and historical context dictate outcomes. Liberia also illustrates how the U.S. government historically treated Black Americans as expendable tools in larger political experiments. Funding, organizing, and promoting colonization was framed as benevolent, but the underlying intent often reinforced white supremacy. The psychological and cultural consequences were profound. Black Americans were told they didn't belong, while simultaneously being asked to forge a new society on foreign land. Generations inherited a narrative of displacement and adaptation, shaping identity, culture, and political thought. Even today, Liberia's history is largely unknown among Americans, yet its impact is visible in diaspora consciousness, African American scholarship, and international relations. Understanding Liberia forces a reckoning with the broader American story. It reveals that systemic exclusion is not limited to domestic borders. It demonstrates how governments have historically tried to control Black futures, both at home and abroad. It underscores the resilience, ingenuity, and agency of Black communities navigating imposed challenges. Most importantly, it challenges the narrative that freedom can be externally administered. Liberia reminds us that liberation is not merely geographic. It is structural, political, and social. Black Americans, whether in the U.S. or abroad, have always had to fight for recognition, rights, and dignity. The American Colonization Society's experiment failed not because Black people were incapable, but because the system itself was flawed. Liberia succeeded where it adapted and persevered, yet the deeper inequalities remained. For modern audiences, the story is urgent and instructive. It asks us to examine the intersections of race, policy, and history. It shows that displacement, even when framed as benevolent, can reproduce old hierarchies in new spaces. It illustrates that understanding diaspora requires confronting uncomfortable truths about power, exclusion, and the legacy of slavery. And it compels us to consider, if the U.S. once tried to send an entire population away to solve racial problems, what does that tell us about the country's past and present commitment to justice. Liberia's history is not merely a footnote. It is a lens through which we can examine American racial politics, the African diaspora, and the resilience of Black communities confronting systemic injustice across continents. For every Black American who stayed, for everyone who migrated, and for the generations that followed, the lessons are clear. Freedom cannot be outsourced, identity cannot be imposed, and history cannot be ignored.